I remember the crisp Breckenridge ere the moment I stepped off the plane, a familiar chill that wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. After months of sun-baked beaches in Mexico and the balmy nights of the Bahamas, the snow-capped peaks of Colorado felt like a homecoming, even though it was just my last stop on this year-long international resort gig. My name is Liam Carter, and I was 28 years old, a professional DJ by trade. And for the past year, I had been spinning tracks at some of the world's most beautiful vacation destinations. This was it, the final stretch. Then I'd be heading back to my own little slice of normal, wherever that might be after a year on the road. There was something freeing about my life, just me, my turntables, and the universal language of music. I loved seeing people move, lose themselves in a beat, forget their troubles, even just for a few hours. It was more than a job. It was a connection, a pulse, a rhythm I lived by. I prided myself on reading a room, knowing exactly what tune would get people on their feet, what melody would pull them into a shared moment of joy. At each resort, I'd built a reputation not just for my skills on the decks, but for my easygoing nature, my ability to connect with guests, to make them feel like the night was truly theirs. Breckenridge was no different. The resort was a sprawling wonderland of luxury and adventure, nestled among some of the most breathtaking scenery I'd ever seen. My DJ booth was a glass-enclosed haven in the heart of the main nightclub, a place where I could command the energy of the room, feel the vibrations of the bass pulsing through the floor, and watch the kaleidoscope of lights dance across the faces of hundreds of eager partygoers. It was around the holiday season, and the club was absolutely buzzing every night. Tourists from all over the world, flushed with the thrill of the slopes and the promise of New Year's celebrations, packed the dance floor, ready to let loose. My sets were drawing a crowd, the kind of vibrant, electric energy that DJs dream of. People loved the mix, the way I seamlessly blended classic rock anthems with modern electronic beats, the unexpected drops, the pure joy I put into every transition. And yes, the ladies, bless their hearts, were always curious. They'd drift towards the booth, tapping on the glass, their eyes sparkling, some holding out their phones for requests, others simply wanting to chat, to flirt, to share a laugh. It was part of the job, part of the vibe. I was professional about it, always polite, always keeping the focus on the music, but I enjoyed the connection. It meant I was doing something right, that I was creating an experience people wanted to be a part of. The head of operations, a stern but fair woman named Ms. Albright, had warned me about a slight hiccup in the management team. The usual resort entertainment manager, a seasoned professional from Canada, was stuck in customs across the border, delayed indefinitely by some visa issue or another. So, she'd assigned a temporary replacement, a young man named Bryce Maxwell. I'd met Bryce briefly when I arrived. He looked to be only a year or two younger than me, but he carried himself with an air of inflated self-importance that grated on me immediately. He was sharply dressed, always seemed to be adjusting his tie, and had a way of looking down his nose at everyone, as if he was constantly assessing their worth and finding it lacking. Ms. Albright had introduced him with a slightly apologetic tone, explaining that Bryce was the son of a major investor in the resort chain, and this was his first real management role. She had stressed that he was temporary, and that I, with my experience, was expected to guide him if necessary, which I found vaguely insulting. I was here to spin tracks, not babysit. From day one, Bryce was a problem. He'd hover outside my booth, arms crossed, a perpetual frown etched on his face. He'd send terse text messages telling me to lower the bass, even when the crowd was clearly thriving on it. He'd interrupt my sets with ridiculous requests for specific, often obscure, songs that cleared the dance floor faster than a fire alarm. It became clear very quickly that he didn't understand the flow of a nightclub, the subtle art of building energy and maintaining it. He was a manager by title only, lacking any real intuition or understanding of entertainment. But the real issue, the one that really got under his skin, was the attention I received. Every time a group of women would approach the booth, their laughter echoing above the music, Bryce would materialize as if by magic, his jaw tightening. He'd glare at them, then at me, his eyes burning with a resentment I couldn't quite comprehend at first. He started telling me to keep the girls out, to focus on the music, as if I wasn't already doing exactly that. He'd pace outside, a little shadow of jealousy and insecurity. I tried to ignore him, to stay professional, to remind myself this was just a temporary nuisance. I was almost home. My time here was limited, and I didn't want to create unnecessary drama. I'd smile politely at the women, offer a quick word, then nod towards the dance floor, subtly encouraging them to join the party out there. But Bryce's actions grew more overt, more irritating. One night, right in the middle of a massive holiday party, the club was at its absolute peak. The energy was electric, sweat was dripping from the ceiling, and people were singing along at the top of their lungs. Suddenly, Bryce's face appeared at the small window of my booth, his eyes narrowed into slits. He motioned for me to open the door. When I did, he leaned in, his voice tight with suppressed anger, barely audible over the thump of the music. "Liam, you need to lock this door. Nobody comes in. You hear me? Focus on the music, and do not let anyone in this booth for any reason." He emphasized anyone with a pointed stare, his gaze sweeping over the various women who were attempting to catch my eye from the perimeter of the dance floor. I blinked at him, surprised by the abruptness of the order. My booth had always been a semi-open space, a place where guests could interact with the DJ, where energy could flow freely. Locking it felt isolating, uncharacteristic of the club's atmosphere. But he was my temporary manager, and I was just a few weeks from the end of my contract. I wasn't going to argue. "Understood, Bryce," I said, my voice calm, even though a knot of irritation was tightening in my stomach. I gave him a quick nod, then closed the heavy, soundproof door and clicked the lock into place. For the next hour, I spun my heart out, delivering one of my best sets of the season. The crowd was wild, a sea of ecstatic faces, their hands in the air, their voices hoarse from screaming lyrics. I watched them, a genuine smile on my face, feeling that familiar rush of connection. It was exactly what I loved about this job, the pure, unadulterated joy I could help create. Then a sharp, insistent knocking rattled the door of my booth. I glanced over, my eyebrows furrowing. It was Bryce, his face pressed against the glass, an urgent, almost desperate expression on his features. He was mouthing something, gesturing wildly. I leaned closer to the glass, trying to make out his words over the thumping bass. He wanted in. He clearly wanted in. My mind flashed back to his exact instructions, the emphasis he'd placed on "nobody comes in" and "lock this door." A flicker of something, maybe defiance, maybe just plain annoyance, sparked within me. I remembered his jealousy, his petty rules, his constant hovering. A small, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of my lips. I shook my head, pointing at the locked door, then mouthing the words, "You told me to lock it. No one in." Bryce's face contorted in disbelief, then rage. He started banging harder on the door, his voice muffled but clearly yelling. He pointed to the crowd, then back at me, his gestures growing more frantic. It was clear what he wanted. He wanted to come in and scope out the women, to get a closer look at the very people he'd told me to keep away. He was a hypocrite, a petty, insecure tyrant. I held my ground for a moment, enjoying the small, silent victory of following his rules to the letter, watching his frustration mount. The crowd was oblivious, lost in the music, swaying and dancing to the beat. But a part of me knew this was a losing battle. He was my manager, however temporary, however incompetent. Eventually, I sighed, the small moment of satisfaction fading into a dull ache of resignation. I relented, unlocking the door and pulling it open, letting the blast of noise from the club wash over me. Bryce stormed in, his face purple with fury, his eyes blazing. He didn't even acknowledge the music or the thriving crowd. He just leaned into my face, his voice a furious hiss that barely cut through the sound system. "What in the hell were you thinking, Liam? Why didn't you open the door? Do you have any idea how important it is that I have access to this booth at all times?" His voice was escalating, becoming a yell, drawing the attention of a few curious onlookers near the booth. He was completely losing it. "I was simply doing what you told me to do, Bryce," I said calmly, my voice flat, refusing to match his volume. "You told me to lock the door and not let anyone in. I followed your instructions precisely." I gestured to the door. "You emphasized no one, remember." He spluttered, his jaw working, unable to form a coherent response. He looked around as if suddenly realizing he was making a public spectacle of himself. The club was packed, every eye seemed to be on us. This wasn't going down how he'd imagined. His face contorted from rage to a cold, hard glare. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You know what, Liam? I'm sick of your attitude. I'm sick of your insubordination. You're fired. Get out. Right now." The words hung in the air, even over the pounding music. Fired me for following instructions. I looked at him, my expression blank, trying to process the absurdity of it. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He was beyond pissed. "You're out of here, Carter. Pack your bags and get off this property tonight." My heart hammered against my ribs, a strange mix of disbelief, anger, and a perverse sense of liberation. Part of me wanted to laugh at the sheer ridiculousness of the situation, but another part was burning with indignation. I'd worked my tail off for this resort, for this company, for a whole year. And this incompetent, insecure kid was firing me for doing exactly what he told me to do. My eyes swept over the dancing crowd, their faces lit up by the pulsing lights, their bodies moving to the beat I had crafted for them. They had no idea what was happening, no idea the music was about to stop. A sudden, bold idea, a spark of defiance, ignited within me. A final, public flourish before I exited this ridiculous stage. I grabbed the microphone, a sudden hush falling over the booth as I lowered the volume on the track. The massive speakers still boomed, but the music was fading. Bryce stared at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. I raised the microphone to my lips. "Attention, everyone." My voice, amplified through the resort's state-of-the-art sound system, boomed across the club, cutting through the chatter and the lingering bass. The crowd, sensing something was up, began to quiet, turning their heads towards the DJ booth. "I'm sorry to announce," I continued, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside me, "that my set and my time here at this beautiful resort is coming to an abrupt end." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. I met Bryce's furious, desperate gaze, a faint, sardonic smile touching my lips. "It seems," I announced, my voice carrying a hint of wry amusement that I hoped conveyed the absurdity of the situation without explicitly detailing it, "that I've been fired. So with that, I bid you all a very good night, and I hope you continue to enjoy your holidays here in Breckenridge." I clicked off the microphone, plunging the club into a sudden, jarring silence. The bass ceased, the lights dimmed slightly, and the buzzing energy of the dance floor evaporated instantly. The hundreds of people who had been dancing just moments before now stood frozen, staring at me, then at Bryce, then back at me, a collective gasp rippling through the room. Bryce, his face ashen, lunged for me, but I was already turning, grabbing my headphones and a small bag with my essentials. I walked out of the booth, past the stunned Bryce, and straight through the silent, bewildered crowd. I could feel their eyes on me, their questions hanging unspoken in the air. I kept my head held high, a peculiar sense of triumph mixing with the sting of injustice. The nightclub was in chaos behind me, a sudden vacuum where the music and energy had been. I didn't look back. I just walked straight out of the club, out of the resort, a strange sense of quiet satisfaction settling over me. What Bryce didn't know, what he hadn't considered in his fit of rage, was the resort's policy for international hires. The rules were clear. If you quit your contract early, you were responsible for paying your own way home, often a very expensive plane ticket, especially during the peak holiday season. But if you were fired, the company was legally obligated to fly you back to your home country. As it was the holidays, flights were completely booked solid for the next week. It meant the resort couldn't get me on a plane until well after New Year's Day. So, instead of being immediately kicked out onto the street, I found myself with a full week of paid accommodation, meals, and access to all the resort's amenities, all expenses covered, with absolutely nothing to do. Bryce's impulsive act had backfired spectacularly on his precious resort's budget, and inadvertently had given me an unexpected, all-inclusive, luxurious forced vacation. The irony was sweet. Act 2. The first day after the firing was a strange blend of quiet introspection and simmering resentment. I woke up in my comfortable resort room, the early morning light filtering through the heavy curtains, and for the first time in a year, I didn't have to rush to a sound check or plan a set list. The silence was deafening after months of constant music. I ate breakfast in the staff cafeteria, a place I usually avoided, acutely aware of the hushed whispers and curious glances from the other resort employees. Word travels fast, especially in a place like this. Everyone knew about the DJ who got publicly fired by the Golden Boy temporary manager. The looks ranged from pity to outright sympathy, with a few flashes of genuine anger on my behalf. I even overheard one of the older waitresses muttering about Bryce's ridiculous entitlement. It was gratifying, in a small way, to know that I wasn't alone in recognizing his douchiness. But the comfort of the free room and board quickly started to wear thin. My mind kept replaying the scene in the club, Bryce's contorted face, his petty accusation, my public walk-off. The immediate satisfaction of sticking it to him had been fleeting, replaced by a deep sense of injustice. This wasn't just about a job. It was about my reputation, my year of hard work, ending on such a sour, undignified note. I was Liam Carter, the DJ who made people dance, who connected with crowds. Now I was just the DJ who got fired by a rich kid with a power complex. It felt like a stain on my record, a blight on my otherwise successful journey. I tried to distract myself. I hit the slopes, enjoyed the pristine snow, something I hadn't had much time for when I was working every night. I went to the spa, used the fancy gym. But everywhere I went, I felt Bryce's shadow. I saw him at the concierge desk, barking orders at the staff. I saw him in the main lodge, strutting around like he owned the place, a smug look on his face. He seemed to be relishing his newfound authority, completely oblivious or simply uncaring about the disruption he had caused. The problem wasn't just that I was fired. It was that Bryce was still there, thriving, while I was stuck in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a flight that couldn't be booked. He had won, or at least that's how it felt. My sense of injustice festered, turning into something cold and sharp. I spent hours alone in my room, staring out at the snow, listening to the silence. My anger wasn't just about being fired anymore. It was about being disrespected, about my professionalism being questioned by someone utterly unqualified. It was about Bryce's inherent unfairness, his petty jealousy, his complete disregard for anyone but himself. And I had a week to do nothing, a week to stew, or a week to think. The idea started as a tiny spark, a mischievous flicker born out of pure frustration. What if this forced, luxurious exile wasn't just a consolation prize, but an opportunity? What if this week was meant for something more than just eating free meals and enjoying free amenities? What if it was my chance to truly even the score, to turn Bryce's petty triumph into his ultimate downfall? The more I thought about it, the more the spark grew into a burning ember. I needed to do more than just get a free flight home. I needed to ensure that Bryce paid a real price for his arrogance, for his incompetence, for making my last month on this international contract a living hell. I began to observe him, not just casual glances, but focused, deliberate observation. I started sitting in the lobby, nursing a coffee, watching his movements. I ate meals in the main dining room just to see how he interacted with other staff, with guests, with Ms. Albright, the head of operations. I learned his schedule. He woke late, usually around 10, spent an hour or two in his office, then made the rounds, micromanaging everything. He frequented the bar in the evenings, trying to schmooze with important guests, often failing miserably because he lacked any genuine charm. He was always trying to impress Ms. Albright, always trying to look busy and important, but beneath the veneer, he was profoundly insecure, completely out of his depth. He didn't understand the resort business, the intricacies of guest relations, the delicate balance of entertainment and service. He was an amateur playing a professional's game. I noticed his weakest points. He was terrible with technology, constantly fumbling with the sound system controls in the club, relying on the tech team for everything. He hated dealing with complaints, always passing them off to someone else. He had a particular aversion to any kind of public speaking or impromptu situations, his face always flushing with panic. And the women, he was still trying, but always getting rejected. He'd approach groups, try to charm them with his fake smile, and inevitably get shot down, leading to more bitterness directed at the male staff who were more successful. This was my leverage. This was his Achilles heel. Bryce was desperate to make a good impression, especially with the holiday season in full swing. I overheard snippets of conversations, hushed tones from staff members. Apparently, the resort chain was looking to fill the entertainment manager position permanently, and Bryce, despite his obvious lack of experience, was lobbying hard for it. His father, the investor, was pulling strings. This wasn't just about temporary authority for him. It was about securing his future, proving himself to his powerful family. The New Year's Eve party was coming up, the biggest event of the entire season. It was the resort's showcase, their chance to impress VIP guests, secure future bookings, and solidify their reputation. Bryce was in charge of it. He was already stressed, pacing around, snapping at staff, trying to control every minute detail. He wanted it to be perfect, flawless, a testament to his managerial brilliance. And that was where I would strike. I started formulating a plan, a meticulously crafted scheme that would expose Bryce for the incompetent, petty, insecure fraud he was, not just to a small club crowd, but to the resort's upper management, to the very people he was trying so desperately to impress. This wouldn't be a public walk-off. This would be a public collapse of his entire facade. It had to be subtle enough that it couldn't immediately be traced back to me, but impactful enough that there was no denying the fallout. I decided to focus on his weaknesses, his reliance on technology, his inability to think on his feet, his desperation to impress, and his deep-seated insecurity about being outshined. I knew the club's sound system like the back of my hand. I knew its quirks, its vulnerabilities, the subtle ways it could be manipulated without leaving obvious traces. I remembered how Bryce had struggled with the most basic controls, how he'd needed the tech team to set up everything, even simple mic levels. This was my domain, the club's main control booth, where the technical side of the sound and lighting was managed, was separate from the DJ booth. It was locked most of the time, but I knew the cleaning staff's schedule, and I knew when they left doors ajar during their rounds. I also knew that many of the resort staff had a quiet resentment towards Bryce. He treated them poorly, spoke down to them, and generally made their lives miserable. There was a glimmer of hope that some of them might even tacitly help me, or at least turn a blind eye if I played my cards right. I started making friends. Not outwardly, not in a way that would draw Bryce's attention, but subtly. I'd linger after meals, striking up conversations with the servers, the baristas, the cleaning crew. I learned names, listened to their grievances about management, particularly Bryce. There was a solidarity amongst them, a shared understanding of how unpleasant he was. I didn't explicitly ask for help, but I dropped hints, subtle comments about things needing to be set right, about people getting what they deserved. I needed to know the layout of the club's control room, the access points. The main server room for the whole resort's entertainment system was also there. It was a goldmine of vulnerabilities. The more I observed, the more I understood that Bryce's plan for the New Year's Eve party was a disaster waiting to happen. He had booked an incredibly expensive, high-profile live band, one known for their elaborate stage setup and demanding technical writers. He was cutting corners, trying to manage the technical aspects himself to save money and impress his father, bypassing the experienced sound engineers and lighting designers. This was perfect. This was the opening I needed. My original problem of being fired, of being stuck, had seemed like the lowest point. But it was only when I realized I was trapped in this golden cage with my tormentor, watching him strut around, that the true depth of my despair and my desire for revenge settled in. I had to make sure he failed and failed spectacularly, and that everyone knew why. The stakes had risen. It wasn't just about getting even. It was about proving that competence matters, that respect is earned, and that genuine talent will always outshine inherited privilege. I spent my days perfecting my plan, visualizing every step, every subtle adjustment, every potential variable. I knew the club, I knew its systems, I knew Bryce. And now I was ready to use all of it against him. I was ready to turn his biggest night into his greatest humiliation. The week dragged on, but with purpose. The bitterness receded, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. The humiliation I had felt was transforming into fuel, igniting a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. I wasn't just Liam Carter. The DJ, I was Liam Carter, the man with a plan, and Bryce Maxwell was about to learn a very hard, very public lesson. Act 3. The air on New Year's Eve was charged with a mixture of excitement and nervous tension. The resort buzzed like a hive, everyone anticipating the grand celebration. Bryce, however, looked like a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He was everywhere, micromanaging every tiny detail, his face pale, his eyes darting frantically. He barked orders at staff, snapped at anyone who dared to ask a question, and continuously checked his watch, as if time itself was his enemy. The live band he'd booked, the Summit Seekers, was famous for their intricate light shows and powerful arena rock sound. Their setup was elaborate, requiring precise technical coordination, and Bryce had promised them a flawless performance. This was his grand display, his moment to shine for his father, who I'd heard was flying in specifically for the event. The plan was meticulously refined, a delicate dance of timing and opportunity. I had scouted the service tunnels and back corridors, charting the most inconspicuous routes to the main control room of the club. I knew the precise 5-minute window when the cleaning crew would finish their final sweep, and the security team would be doing their last-minute rounds before the doors opened to the VIP guests. My disguise was simple: a resort staff uniform, conveniently left unattended in a laundry cart I'd found. I'd also acquired a generic staff ID badge, easy enough to fake with a bit of ingenuity and access to the resort's printer during an unsupervised moment. The clock ticked closer to showtime. I felt a surge of adrenaline, not the familiar rush of a DJ stepping into the booth, but the cold, focused intensity of someone about to execute a complex operation. I slipped into the back corridors, the uniform feeling surprisingly natural, the ID badge hanging heavy around my neck. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. I knew exactly what I was doing. The service entrance to the control room was just where I'd anticipated, the door ajar, the cleaning supplies still visible inside. I slipped in, moving quickly, silently. The control room was a maze of blinking lights, monitors, and complex soundboards. This was where the magic happened, where the entire audio-visual experience of the club was orchestrated. And this was where Bryce had made his biggest mistake, entrusting the final setup to inexperienced technicians under his direct, clueless supervision. I knew the layout, remembered the precise settings the regular DJs and sound engineers used. Bryce, in his arrogance, had overridden many of them, applying his own, ill-informed adjustments. He'd also left a few crucial system overrides unprotected, thinking he was the only one who knew about them. My goal was not to completely sabotage the system and shut down the party. That would be too obvious, too easily traced, and it would ruin the night for everyone. My goal was to introduce subtle, cumulative errors that would expose Bryce's incompetence, making him look utterly out of his depth, especially when confronted by a high-profile band and a VIP audience. I went to work. First, the microphone levels for the band's lead singer. Bryce had set them incredibly low, probably out of some misguided attempt to control the overall volume. I subtly adjusted the gain, just enough so that when the band started, the vocals would be barely audible over the instruments. Then, the lighting. The Summit Seekers had a complex light show, perfectly synchronized with their music. Bryce had simplified it, probably thinking it was too complicated. I reactivated a few of the more sensitive sequences, the ones that would require quick, expert adjustments during the performance. If Bryce didn't know how to control them, the lights would become a chaotic, flashing mess, completely out of sync with the music. Next, the feedback suppression. There was a sophisticated system in place to prevent ear-splitting feedback from the microphones. Bryce, in his arrogance, had fiddled with it, probably thinking he was making it sound cleaner. I subtly disabled a key component, ensuring that at a critical moment, When the band hit a high note or moved too close to a speaker, the dreaded screech would pierce through the club. Finally, the main sound mix. I knew the band's sound engineer usually had a perfectly balanced mix for their instruments. Bryce had apparently tried to enhance the bass, making it muddy and overwhelming. I tweaked the equalizer, not enough to ruin the sound entirely, but just enough to make it sound slightly off, a little distorted, especially during their loudest numbers. And the crowning touch, a tiny, almost invisible piece of code I'd managed to write, a subtle sequence that would occasionally cause a very brief, almost imperceptible delay in the main sound output, enough to throw off a live performance, but so minute it would be hard to pinpoint. All of this was done in a frantic 5 minutes, my fingers flying across the controls, my eyes scanning the schematics I'd memorized. Just as I heard the distinct sound of security approaching, I slipped out of the room, leaving no trace, melding back into the staff corridors. The main ballroom was transformed into a dazzling spectacle of lights and sound equipment. VIP guests, including Bryce's father, a formidable-looking man with a no-nonsense gaze, were taking their seats. The energy was palpable. The summit seekers took the stage, the crowd roaring their approval. The lights dimmed, the first chords rang out, and the show began. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. The band was powerful, their music filled the room. Bryce, standing at the back with Ms. Albright and his father, had a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. Then the subtle chaos began. The lead singer's voice, powerful as it was, seemed to get lost in the mix. People at the back started leaning in, straining to hear the lyrics. Bryce frowned, adjusted his tie, and started subtly motioning to a junior tech nearby, clearly unhappy. Then came the lights. Instead of the choreographed precision the summit seekers were known for, the spotlights started flashing erratically, sometimes blinding the audience, sometimes leaving the stage in darkness. It was disjointed, amateurish. The band members exchanged confused glances. Bryce's face began to pale. He rushed over to the junior tech, whispering furiously, pointing frantically at the control board. The tech, clearly overwhelmed, started fiddling with the controls, making it worse. Just as the band launched into their most popular anthem, a piercing, ear-splitting feedback shriek tore through the room. It was loud, sustained, and utterly jarring. People instinctively covered their ears, wincing. The band momentarily stopped playing, the lead singer shaking his head. Bryce's face went from pale to ghostly white. He began to sweat, frantically trying to find the source of the problem, but he was completely out of his depth. The delayed sound output, imperceptible to most, began to subtly throw off the band's rhythm. They were professionals, but even they couldn't compensate for a sound system that was constantly just a millisecond off. Their performance, which should have been electrifying, started to feel sluggish, slightly off-kilter, losing its precision. The proud, booming bass he'd wanted now sounded muddy, drowning out the intricacies of the guitars. The audience, initially excited, began to look restless, confused. Whispers started, not about the band, but about the technical issues. Bryce's father, a man who clearly appreciated efficiency and perfection, rose from his seat, his gaze fixed on his son, a thundercloud brewing on his face. Ms. Albright, her expression grim, started asking pointed questions. "Bryce, what's happening with the sound?" "The lighting is completely off. This is unacceptable." Bryce stammered, making excuses, blaming the band's equipment, blaming the junior tech. He tried to take over the control board himself, but his clumsy attempts only made things worse. He hit the wrong buttons, accidentally muted channels, and created more feedback. It was a disaster, a complete unraveling of his carefully constructed illusion of competence. I watched it all from a discreet corner of the balcony, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on my face. The poetic justice was exquisite. Bryce, who had publicly humiliated me for following his instructions, was now publicly humiliating himself for his utter lack of skill. He had tried to outshine me, to diminish my talent, and now his own incompetence was laid bare for all to see, especially for the people whose opinions mattered most to him. The climax arrived when the band, utterly frustrated, announced a premature intermission, cutting their set short. The crowd dispersed, grumbling. Bryce's father, his face a mask of disappointment and cold fury, pulled his son aside, his voice low but cutting. I couldn't hear the words, but the rigid set of Bryce's shoulders, the way he seemed to visibly shrink, told me everything. His aspirations for a permanent management role, his carefully constructed career, were crumbling right before his eyes. As the crowd shuffled out, I slipped away. My job was done. The revenge wasn't about anger anymore. It was about vindication. It was about proving that true talent and integrity always prevail over petty jealousy and inherited privilege. I didn't want to see Bryce suffer. I just wanted him to face the consequences of his actions, to learn that respect had to be earned. The next morning, a resort manager I hadn't seen before, a stern but kind-eyed woman named Sarah, knocked on my door. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice formal, "Ms. Albright has asked me to extend her sincerest apologies for the unfortunate incident. She understands the circumstances of your departure were regrettable." She paused, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "And she was particularly dismayed by the technical difficulties last night. It appears Mr. Maxwell was far out of his depth." She handed me a plane ticket, first class, with a direct flight home that same day. "Consider this a token of the resort's appreciation for your professionalism throughout the year, and an apology for the unpleasantness." As I packed my bags, a lightness settled over me that I hadn't felt in weeks. I wasn't leaving Breckenridge in bitterness or defeat. I was leaving on my own terms, vindicated, my head held high. My year-long journey hadn't ended on a sour note after all. Just as I was about to leave my room for good, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Ms. Albright. It wasn't a rehire offer, but something even better. She had been impressed by my cool demeanor during the firing, my subtle actions to highlight Bryce's incompetence, and my clear understanding of the club's technical systems. She had a contact at a major entertainment conglomerate, a company that managed DJs and live event production for high-end venues globally. She had put in a good word, highlighting my professionalism and deep technical knowledge. There was an opening for a technical and entertainment consultant, a role far more advanced and prestigious than simply being a resort DJ. The twist was, this new role would involve troubleshooting live event problems, often dealing with managers who were out of their depth. It was a perfect fit. I was Liam Carter, and my journey was far from over. I was leaving Breckenridge not just with a free flight, but with a new career path, a new purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some lessons, like the one Bryce Maxwell had just learned, were best taught by experience, especially when it played out on the biggest stage.